Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Newman. I'm the Outreach Director for the British Institute of Persian Studies, and welcome to our first webinar of 2023. Happy 2023 to everyone. This is Making and Unmaking Community, Urban Life in Persianate Rajasthan by Dr. Elizabeth Thelen from the University of Exeter. Dr. Thelen is a historian of South Asia and an honorary research fellow at the College of Humanities at the University of Exeter here in the UK. She studies the legal, social, and religious history of Rajasthan. Her book, Urban Histories of Rajasthan, Religion, Politics, and Society from 1550 to 1800 is published by Ginkgo Press 2022, and it is part of the series of the BIPS Persian Studies series. She's also the author of Disputed Transactions, Documents, Language and Authority in 18th Century Marwar, and she is an editor of the digital resource Law Forms, Digitized Legal Documents from the Indo-Persian World. And without further ado, Elizabeth, I'll ask you to get started, and I'm going to mute myself and take my picture off. So Dr. Thelen, carry on, please.
All right, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction and for providing me with this opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you to all of our audience for joining us for this. I'm just bringing up my slides and getting the show started. So as was mentioned, I recently, my book came out this past year, so this talk will touch on some material from that, give you a bit of an introduction to some of the larger issues and topics that I take up in my book, Urban Histories of Rajasthan. And so to start with, this is really the question that I started with when I started this research project. What did it mean to live together in diverse urban centers? There's a tradition in literature from South Asia, from medieval and early modern period, of praising the diversity of cities in the descriptions that were presented as quite positive things. But I was wondering, on the ground, what did it actually mean for all of these groups to live together? And where did we potentially see patterns of rupture? Because this was also speaking to the historiography of India, of South Asia, where there's been a tendency to focus, if we're thinking about social conflict, to focus very exclusively in this period on questions of Hindu-Muslim conflict. And so I was wondering what happened if we expanded and looked at conflict more broadly and how people lived together or didn't manage to live together. And also what happened if we started looking at society as a whole, instead of focusing on the upper echelons, the royal court and such, and instead took a broader view of society. And so a couple of the key things that I found, sort of the big takeaways, is that our inter and intra-community relations were encoded in the legal structures. So there was an active use by various communities of legal resources, whether those were going to a qazi's court or going to a panchayat tribunal, various resources, getting documents written to encode who was part of a community, who wasn't part of a community, and to try to resolve these conflicts both within and between communities. And another thing that I wanted to bring up right at the beginning of something that I point to throughout the work is that community identity is not a given. So we can't always say that someone always identified as a particular part of a particular community as a constant present of how they navigated the world, but instead it's activated in certain contexts, right? And that might feel very familiar to how we think about things today, but sort of the sources also repeatedly show different rhetorical strategies of people, identifying them in certain ways to make a sympathetic case. And if we look at conflict and violence more broadly, what we see is that it occurs mostly with proximity. So that perhaps at the level of the court, at the level of those high-level manuscripts, we do see a lot of rhetorical discussion of Hindu-Muslim conflict, in part because we had Hindu and Muslim nobles, for instance, in the Mughal court, in close proximity, vying for different resources. As we start looking at other social groups, that's not necessarily where the fracture falls. Along those sorts of religious identities. It's instead perhaps around caste in terms of jati, those sorts of identities, occupational identities, people who are using shared resources. And then the last part was really how people lived together. And that was that I found that what we have in the archive primarily for looking at urban centers is a history of people having routine and sustained minor disputes that seem to have been able to diffuse major conflicts. So we don't see in our urban centers in, say, the 16th through 18th century, very often any sort of outbreak of major physical violence or riots, but we do see this constant jostling and oftentimes disputes that go back and forth to the same authorities over many decades, perhaps over generations. Why am I talking about disputes mostly when the question is, what did it mean to live together in diverse urban centers? Part of that is, what gets recorded in our archive. So our archive, of legal documents is going to record the moments when people had conflict. People aren't coming to see the judge or petition the king for justice when everything is going well. So I have this image here too. This is also on the cover of the book. It's an image that I found useful to think with. One of the few paintings, sort of an episode that took place at Nagaur that I found. Nagaur being one of the urban centers I focus on. Depicting in the foreground the cleaning of the tank ordered by the Emperor Akbar in the 1570s, with various residents of the city in the midground. There's a second panel of this painting, which has the emperor on horseback. That's who all the people in the midground are appealing to, and then a depiction of a city in the background, which by the title is implied as Nagaur, but as we know from miniature painting traditions or album painting traditions, these cities can be sort of generic in how they're depicted here. So where am I talking about? I focused in the book on three main urban centers: Nagaur, Ajmer, and Pushkar. A lot of this was for archival reasons, but also thinking about cities that were, long-standing centers, both of political power, but also religious centers and trade centers. So they did have this multi-networked connections and a long history of being urban centers here. So if you look at the map, Nagaur is this fairly far to the west of the major urban centers in Rajasthan. It's along trade routes to Sindh and Tata, but also, nearing the border of the Thar Desert. So the next part that I want to spend a little bit of time on is why am I talking about Rajasthan to a Persian studies audience? This might be a little bit further afield than a lot of the talks in this series, and a lot of it is because I found it useful in my work to think about Persianate Rajasthan. So to think about Rajasthan's long-standing ties to the Persianate world. Some of those were political ties. Rajasthan was part of the Delhi Sultanate starting in the 12th century and extending through the 14th. From the early 15th century, Nagaur itself and those environs became part of a Nagaur Sultanate, which was also the ruler and founder of that, Shams Khan, was related to the ruler of the Gujarat Sultanate. So these political ties tied them into wider networks politically of authorities who were engaged with the Persianate world. This was also the period started from the 12th century when Chishti and Qadri Sufi centers, especially other lineages as well, but especially those two, were established in Rajasthan. So most famous of these, of course, is the Saint Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti, who's buried in Ajmer. But in Nagaur, we have one of his initial disciples, his dargah. It's the gate here of that dargah is what I have pictured, Khwaja Humiduddin Chishti, Sufi Sawali, who lived in the early 14th century, early 13th century. And so we have these lineages being established, these connections of Sufi scholars throughout the region. And then we also have other additional intellectual networks. So Nagaur itself, again, and I'm focusing on it here because the case studies that I'll show you in a bit are also focused in Nagaur, was part of wider intellectual networks, was really a center of learning in this period. For example, one of the most well-known authors from Nagaur is the physician Shahabuddin Nagauri, who wrote a well-known 1388 treatise on medicine. And in that, he gives a little biography of himself in which he recounts having studied with a hakim or physician in Kabul, as well as having studied with yogis. So his life is perhaps representative of the sort of intellectual circulation that's going on in this region, in this period, these networks of travel and exchange. These connections to the Persian world and Rajasthan's enmeshment with it only deepened under Mughal rule. Part of this was due to really close Rajput-Mughal alliances. There were a couple of Rajput rulers who pretty consistently resisted Mughal rule, but most of them did enter alliances, often both marriage alliances, as well as taking on royal ranks in the Mughal court, starting really from the reign of Akbar in the mid-16th century. And Rajasthan itself, that whole region, maps almost directly onto the boundaries of the Mughal province, Suba Ajmer, and that Mughal provincial government there really did impact sort of how, brought in Persianate models of rule, of legal documents. Those sorts of documents did become widespread. And again, while Rajasthan tends to be thought of as, these series of Rajput kingdoms, a large portion of that area was actually under direct Mughal rule in the 16th and 17th centuries. During this period, also, we continue to have trade, migration, and circulation, connecting the region again to Sindh and Tata and beyond to Kandahar, etc., and also connections via trade routes to the sea and circulation that way. The last part I already mentioned briefly, but we do also have this Persian document culture in Rajasthan. So we do see a widespread use of Persian documents, especially in the 1560s and 1730s through 1730s. The example that I show you here is a document coming from, a shrine community in Nagaur, but it wasn't just restricted to, say, a community like that who we might expect to be educated in Persian. It was used, by the Rajput rulers. It was used by scribes, local administrators, etc. And we see actually in later Rajasthani documents from the end of the 18th century, relatively frequent references by petitioners, as part of their evidence that they have a Persian document, or in the Rajasthani, they say katte parsiro. And so we have this connection, or this use of the language. We see a lot of times, multilingual documents. In the case of this document, right, the main text is in Persian, but then we have various parties signing it using Rajasthani. And we see forms and vocabulary being borrowed across languages in this area where both Persian and Rajasthani documents are circulating. So when I speak of Persianate Rajasthan, those are the concepts I'm pulling on, and part of it is to make sure that when I'm, as I looked, more closely at case studies of various places, to keep thinking about the wider connections. So the first case study here is to talk about the Pirzada lineages, right? So these are descendants of the saints who controlled the Sufi shrines and performed rituals. They were both the spiritual and often the practical administrators of these shrines. These shrines, such as the shrine of Sultan Tariqin that I showed you the picture of previously, they drew in a fair amount of resources as far as patronage from rulers, including from the 16th century onwards, when we have lots of documentary records. It was both Mughals and Rajputs. And so this state patronage really shored up the power and the finances of the community, and may have elevated their ability to influence events in the city. At the same time, it was often a spur for intra-community conflict over access to the patronage. So there are constant disputes, and we see within these communities, and I was lucky enough to have access to some private collections of documents relating to these communities. We see a constant set of disputes. So for instance, in about 1651, we have a claim between descendants of sort of two lines within the main family, going to the court actually in Ajmer, seeking a settlement of this dispute. A century later, we have a dispute that lasts 20 years and goes sort of across two generations, as there's an attempt by part of the Pirzada community at this Chishti shrine to kick out a specific family from the shrine's majlis, or meetings. And this family then brought cases repeatedly before Marwar's, that's the polity, the Rajput polity that was ruling the area at the time, before their court at least 4 times, trying to get these rights reinstated. Another case study, another area that I explore in the book is issues of sharing common resources. So here, speaking of water rights, one of the things that became clear, Rajasthan being a desert area, especially, that water was a really highly regulated site of economic production in these urban areas. And rulers, one of their, sort of main activities of urban improvement was either building new water tanks or, as was illustrated in this painting, right, sponsoring the desilting and improvement of existing water resources. But we see here that, because it's such an important driver of industry, then drought also could heighten competition and conflict. So, for example, in 1776, we have cloth printers from a community known as chipa and washers or dhobis who bring a petition to the king complaining that mud from the buffaloes is ruining their work. In the initial order, the king responds by allowing the animal herders, the gosis, to continue to use the water for their buffalo. And in one of the perhaps most difficult to implement orders I've read in the archives, this was as long as they stopped the water buffalo from muddying the water or stepping on clothes laid out to dry on the bank. And I said it's most difficult to enforce if you've ever met or watched a water buffalo. This would be hard to stop them from doing. And so the dispute then dragged on over the course of 7-8 months, back and forth petitions, with eventually the cloth printers and the washers were able to press their case to the court, and the cowherds were instructed to move their cattle to another water location. Now, this proximity, this conflict, the immediate trigger was a matter of water shortage. It had been a drought year. If we looked at, sort of community affiliations of some of the participants in the community, you could read it as Hindu or Muslim conflict. However, that's not the way the conflict is framed at all. It's really about these economic needs and these conflicting uses of the same resource. The other point here is that, we need to be careful when we're thinking about the pre-colonial period of thinking that, a commons like this was maybe, unregulated or always sort of, equally and easily shared between groups. It clearly was drawing, state intervention and the designation of specific rights and locations. The last case study I want to briefly share with you is dealing with the topic of war, migration, and property. So here we see what happens to the urban fabric in the, under the stress of wartime, and the way that that contributed to long-term migration, but not sort of a permanent migration. It also contributed to state redistribution of urban property. So Nagaur was a very, as well as being a trade center, a center of artisanal production, etc., it was also an important fortified city. And in the 18th century, for a while, the political capital of a Rajput ruler who was in a succession dispute. And so it came under siege in 1755 and 1756. There was almost a year-long siege by the Marathas. And at this period, we don't have a lot of detailed records from that period specifically, but the records we do have suggest that there was also famine conditions in the area. And what we see in later records is that that siege contributed to a large number of people moving to other areas within the broader region. So maybe they fled to relatively nearby cities such as Jodhpur, maybe they went further afield to Malwa. But people did move out of Nagaur. But within about 15, 20 years, a lot of those people started moving back. And so in 1773, we have a petition brought by 5 weavers from the Julaha community, arguing that 2 pieces of land in one of Nagaur's neighborhoods was their ancestral property that had belonged to their great-grandfather and great-uncle. And they made the legal claim that, you know, sort of this property was ancestral. In Rajasthani, there's a term baputi that people use, that the land's been occupied by their family for a certain amount of time. It does convey certain rights to them. And they also expressed it as they considered this property to be their vatan, their homeland. They presented in their petition, however, that they had fled in 1755, the year the city was besieged, gone to Jodhpur, and that after that point, the local government had claimed their property as part of the crown land and then resold it to a group of merchants. So one of the things that's interesting here is to think about these long-term occupation patterns. So in a lot of other petitions, we do get people actually sort of referencing, you know, the year of the deed that they're presenting, if they're presenting a document to prove their claim. And so we will get people, you know, in the 1770s presenting deeds from, say, 1593 or 1628 to prove their ownership of specific properties when they're returning after having left during the siege. But we also then see now in the 1770s, we do start to see a shift in the way that the rhetoric is being presented. And some of this is maybe shifting sensibilities about who can live together, but also shifting sensibilities of where the ruler's sympathies are. So in this particular dispute, when the city officials as well as the merchants respond, they say, no, this area has always been a Hindu area, and you weavers who are Muslim, you know, it's not possible for us to live together. They basically just make that broad statement. The details in the petition suggest, you know, and certainly the weavers make the claim that they'd lived together for centuries and don't see a problem. And you know, the record ends as far as not letting us know exactly where these weavers ended up, but they did, they were at some point offered alternative property elsewhere. So we see attempts to sort of remake neighborhoods and to try segregating the neighborhoods in new ways after the conflict, with state support and state intervention at this period. So just to conclude and make sure we leave plenty of time for your questions, you know, what I also want to draw out from these examples is that the experience of urban community was formed in the context of the wider political economy. So in each of these examples, right, the role of the wider state, the influence of economic changes is present in how communities you know, negotiate over conflicts and what sort of conflicts they find themselves in and how they're identifying within those conflicts. And the state took a role sometimes in intra-community, although a lot of that was dealt with by sort of more caste tribunal structures, including in this period a lot of the Muslim communities here, such as the Pirzadas, by the 18th century, were also using panchayat type structures to resolve issues. But the state especially did get involved when there was inter-community disputes. And here again, we do see these disputes. I've just narrated a couple for you. But none of these seem to have, say, escalated into physical violence. Certainly there was property disputes. There was, people were harmed economically through them, but we don't see sort of maybe what some of our reading of rhetoric in the manuscripts might lead us to expect of either complete harmony or complete chaos, depending on which manuscript you're reading. We see instead this sort of processual, gradual, long-term minor conflict. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to answering some of your questions.
That was terrific. Thanks, Elizabeth, very much. Just a reminder to folks to use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Reserve my right as the MC or the host to, oh, bang, I've already got some. Okay, I'll ask one of my ones. One of the questions I had was, you were alluding to trade, and it's over the period of time, do you see, as it were, foreign merchants and traders residing in the community over time? By foreign, I don't, this is pre, as you say, East India Company and such, but I'm thinking more of Iranians and further west, Ottomans or whatever, but also further east on a trade entrepot. Do we have any evidence of different groups of people there by virtue of languages being spoken or anything like that? And if so, in what particular trading activities or artisanal activities?
We don't have any particular evidence that I've found so far of those communities making long-term settlement in the period for which I have detailed records. There's implications, including through some of the early graveyards in Nagaur, that, for instance, there may have been Ismaili communities or other communities migrating and settling there, but we don't have extensive textual evidence from a later period suggesting that people were settling more, that it was, places with reliable water and a safe place to stop overnight. So you did have caravan trains coming through, but.
And were the main, as it were, Muslim groups were mainly the Sufi orders? Were there other sort of Sunni, aside from the Ismailis, other Shi'i groups of which there is evidence? I like the stuff of the cemeteries. I think that's a terrific way to begin to poke around and see who was there.
Yeah, so it seems to have been largely Sunni communities, and there were a wide range of artisan communities who were practicing Muslims. So, for instance, the weavers that I was talking about, part of the washer community was Muslim. There was a large ironworking community in Nagaur who also was predominantly Muslim. So there is a large number of artisan Muslim communities, as well as these Pirzada communities, and some additional, Mughal nobles who will get posted to the area for a particular period of time, or sort of nobility level migrants and settlers.
So this is absolutely terrific, very interesting. And I want to thank you very much, Dr. Thelen, for this, and also people listening in, and also all the excellent questions. And with that, may I bid everyone a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.